To change the stroke attributes of multiple objects at one time, the steps to use the ink bottle tool are: select the ink bottle tool, choose a stroke color as described in using the stroke and fill controls in the toolbox. Choose line style and line width from the stroke panel. Paint bucket tool. The paint bucket tool fills enclosed areas with color. It can both fill empty areas and change the color of already painted areas. You can paint with solid colors, gradient fills, and bitmap fills. You can also use the paint bucket tool to adjust the size, direction, and center of gradient and bitmap fills. The steps to use paint bucket tool to fill an area are: select the paint bucket tool, choose a fill color from the color toolbox. Click the gap size modifier and choose a gap size option. Don't close gaps. If you want to close the gaps manually before filling the shape, closing gaps manually can be faster for complex drawings. Choose one of the close options to have flash fill a shape that has gaps. Click the shape or enclosed area that you want to fill. The steps to adjust a gradient or bitmap fill with the paint bucket tool are: select the paint bucket tool, click the transform fill, click an area filled with a gradient or bitmap fill. The timeline. The timeline is the area where we organize and control time-based animation in Flash. Flash documents divide lengths of time into frames. In our document, we can set how many frames are shown per second. This is known as the frame rate. When the frames are shown in a sequential order, our brain interprets changes between frames as animation. When an animation has a slow frame rate, we are able to see each frame individually, and the movement appears choppy. When the frame rate is high, our brain can no longer pick out individual frames and the animation looks clean. To give you a reference for what typical frame rates are, keep these numbers in mind. The default FPS frames per second setting in Flash is 12 FPS. A typical Hollywood movie uses 24 FPS and TV movies are usually around 30 FPS. It is not necessary for a Flash document to have a frame rate of 24 or 30 FPS, since animations are typically used on the web. And a higher frame rate dramatically increases the size of the document. 12 FPS gives us a smooth animation without a large file size. The timeline layout. Different components of the timeline: toggle lock layer, timeline header, playhead, frame layer, create new layer, create new folder, delete layer, toggle layer visibility, create frame button, onion skinning buttons, frame by frame animation, elapsed time indicator, frame rate indicator, current frame indicator. Layers are used to determine which elements appear in the foreground and which appear in the background, creating a visual stacking order for objects on the stage. While a single layer is sufficient for static graphics, computer-assisted animations require their own layers. To create multiple animations, you need multiple layers. Layers appear above the stage in the main Flash document window in a timeline. The timeline actually resides in its own panel, which is anchored at the top of the main document window by default. Working with layers. The standard view of a layer is the one that shows the image. Let's see the different buttons available in the Layers panel and how to use them. Adding layers. New layers can be added as needed when working with a particular scene in the Flash movie. The steps to add an additional layer are: in the timeline, left-click one of the existing layers to select it. Select the Insert menu, go to Timeline, go to Layer. A new layer will be created on top of the selected layer. The layer will be given a default name, Renaming Layers. By default, each layer is named in numeric sequence such as Layer 1, Layer 2, Layer 3, and so on. It is always more useful to assign meaningful names to each layer so that their function within the Flash project is understood. Meaningful names can be assigned to a layer by renaming it. The steps to rename a layer are: in the timeline, double-click on the layer name. The layer name will appear in a text box with the entire name selected. Enter the desired name of the layer. Press the Enter key. Working with multiple layers. As previously discussed, layers provide a means to manage and control specific elements of a Flash project. In the coming sections, we will illustrate the use of multiple layers in a project. The steps to create a circle layer are: open a new Flash document. In the timeline, double-click on the default layer name and rename the layer Circle. In the Tools panel, select the Oval tool. In the Colors panel, set the fill color as required. Draw a circle in the middle of the stage. The steps to create a rectangle layer are: insert a new layer from Insert menu. Go to Timeline, go to Layer. A new layer is added above the circle layer in the timeline. Double-click on it and rename it to Rectangle. In the Toolbox panel, select the Rectangle tool. In the Colors panel, set the fill color as required. Draw a rectangle on top of the circle on the stage. The steps to create a polygon layer are: insert a new layer from Insert menu. Go to Timeline, go to Layer. A new layer is added above the rectangle layer in the timeline and rename it to Polygon. Right-click on Rectangle tool in the Toolbox panel and select the Polystar tool. In the Colors panel, set the fill color as required. Draw a polygon on top of the rectangle on the stage. The steps to change the layer order are: on the timeline, left-click and drag the polygon layer below the rectangle layer. The rectangle layer will now be on top of the polygon layer. Advanced layer techniques. In addition to adding, renaming and changing the order of layers, there are additional features that make it easier to work with layers. These include locking and hiding layers, locking and unlocking a layer. Locking layers is particularly useful when many layers are used and the user does not want a particular layer or layers to be modified. To lock a layer, in the timeline, click the bullet button below the Lock, Unlock All Layers button of the layer that will be locked. Once clicked, the bullet will change to the Lock or Unlock button. To unlock a layer, click the Lock or Unlock button. Hiding and displaying a layer. Hidden layers are useful when working with multiple layers. Instead of viewing all the layers at once, layers can be hidden from view to make the work easier. To hide a layer. In the timeline, click the bullet button below the Show or Hide All Layers button of the layer that will be hidden. Once clicked, the bullet will change to the Cross button. To display a hidden layer, click the Cross button. Frames. Animation is the rapid display of sequential still images that, when displayed fast enough, give the illusion of motion. In Flash, we call each of these still images a frame. Frames refers to the still images that, when shown sequentially, create the illusion of animation. FPS. It stands for frames per second. When the FPS number is between 16 and 24, the human brain can perceive motion. Keyframe. Keyframes are the drawings which define a movement. In the workflow of traditional hand-drawn animation, the senior or key artist would draw the keyframes. After testing and approval of the rough animation, the scene would be handed over to their assistant. In Flash, the key phrase